And interestingly, so many feminists just shut their eyes, don't want to hear it, don't want to see it. They take to the streets for an organization that rapes girls, and they take to the streets and declare that putting a grenade into a girl's vagina and exploding it there is some sort of liberation, resistance. Hello, my name is Tom David Frey, and I'm a freelance journalist and filmmaker from Germany and Switzerland. After weeks of reporting from the Middle East, this episode takes a step back from the day-to-day politics and personal stories. Instead, we're diving into the latest developments. It seems recognizing a Palestinian state is becoming increasingly popular, but what does that really entail? And is it the right move at this time? That's what we'll explore in today's episode. If you enjoy my podcast and want more content in English, please visit www.tomdavidfrey.com to support calm and independent journalism. Let's get started. Several European countries just recently decided to grant Palestine statehood. Spain, Ireland, Norway, and Slovenia decided to acknowledge the Palestinians a country. Now, before we get into the historical and religious backgrounds and the questions that must be answered in order to understand whether or not recognizing Palestine as a state is a smart move by now, or whether it's more in pieces way, we should first off focus on the definition of a state. What is a state? So there is the so-called three elements rule, and it takes these three elements in order to form a state. So first of all, it takes a people. Secondly, it takes a state territory. And thirdly, it takes a state authority. That is the three elements that you need in order to form a state. Now, looking at the Palestinians, are they a people? One could say ethnically they're not, because Palestinians are not like an ethnic group. They are Arabs. But all it takes in order to be a people from this perspective is that people have a sense of being a people. Now, one can definitely say that after the term Palestinians was chosen in the mid-60s, that they did actually start to be a people. So check mark on that. Now, when it comes to the state territory, it is not required to be able to put out a map and draw an exact border. All it takes is like a reference point. So one could say that the reference point for a Palestinian state is the West Bank, the so-called West Bank, that some also call Judea and Samaria, and others call Palestine, and Gaza. Now, which place exactly could be used, which town, which city? One could, of course, argue Jerusalem might be like the core interest of a Palestinian state, might be what unites the Palestinians as a people. But in order to argument or to take Jerusalem as your argument, it's rather controversial looking at historic data and also looking at religious questions. We're going to get to that a little bit later. So if the Palestinians instead choose like Ramallah, then we could also say, yes, they also have a state territory. Check mark on that as well. Now, finally, when looking at state authority, this is actually where the Palestinians really lack a quality that is required in order to form a state. Because what do they have in the West Bank? They have a ruler who was elected many years ago and was never re-elected, Mahmoud Abbas. He's the head of the so-called Fatah organization. And in Gaza, we have the Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization by definition. They abuse everyone. They wildly abuse their enemies, but they also abuse their own people. They make their own people suffer for their cause. So a government, I don't know, it should just simply try to protect people's lives. It should try to elevate people's lives. Now, Hamas in Gaza clearly states the opposite. Not only do they use humans as human shields, which has become very obvious in the last or in the ongoing war, but also, and this is so obvious as well, there was this one interview, I think it was with the Russian media, where they asked Hamas why they actually didn't use any of the millions or billions of dollars they got in aid in order to build shelters for their people, but only tunnels for themselves. And Hamas declared that they don't see it as their responsibility to look after the people. Now, this is interesting. A government's rule or a government's cause of existence is to look after their people. Now, even though Hamas also got elected by the people of Gaza, they don't really behave like a true government. And also, as we can see, we have the Fatah movement, which some people feel is less radical. And then we have the Hamas movement, which is radical by definition. On the other hand side, they don't really mix well because Hamas and Fatah, they're also fighting. So there is not this, I don't know, one state authority, this one government that can look after people, that has authority, that can also represent the Palestinian people abroad. So that is actually a major obstacle in a Palestinian state's way, even though, obviously, it is also maybe the obstacle that might be easiest to solve for people. People could simply overthrow Hamas, overthrow Fatah, and elect some leaders who have an interest rather in elevating their lives than in fighting their enemies. But as long as they don't do it, well, one could say 2 out of the 3 elements that are required in order to form a state, the Palestinians check. And the 3rd element they still have to work on. Now, when countries like Spain, Ireland, Norway, and Slovenia, when they recognized Palestine as a state, it's not really like it's a major game changer. It's more of a symbolic act. Maybe they will open an embassy in Ramallah and not some kind of a bureau, one of these offices that is not actually an embassy but functions as one. But in order, for example, for Palestine to become a United Nations member state, it also takes the United Nations Security Council's approval. Now, without that approval, a country, a state of Palestine, will not formally be recognized. And as America and Great Britain both do not recognize a Palestinian state, it's going to be rather difficult for Palestine to gain a member seat within the United Nations. Now, before we get into the details, before we look into history, and before we talk about the Quran, let's firstly focus on more regions that also show autonomy efforts. Countries that want to, either liberate maybe from another country or that want to form their own state and want to be recognized. So there are many different conflicts still going on, which is something that the media oftentimes doesn't report on, while they always focus on this Israel-Palestine issue, which seems like a double standard. So the people in Chechnya, in Russia, they can tell you a long story of how they try to form their own state. For example, in Germany, we have like 50,000 people from that region living in our state. They simply cannot return, not because they're poor, but because they might get arrested or because they might get integrated into the military apparatus that Russia has set up there. Next is Kurdistan. I recently traveled to Iraq and visited Kurdistan, and I can say that within the region of the Middle East, and now except for Israel, Kurdistan is probably the most developed place you will find. Especially in comparison with the Arab neighbors, Kurdistan seems somewhat modern, seems somewhat cosmopolitan even. Now the Kurds, and they are an ethnic group, they date back for a very long time in history. Many times did they try to get their own piece of land. Now they always argue with Turkey, with Iran, with Iraq, and with Syria. So this is where many Kurdish people live, and this is where they want to establish their own state. But until now, the West always let them down. The West never recognized the Kurdish people's right to have their own country, and not even after the Kurdish people fought ISIS, also in the West's name, because it was the Kurds who gave their lives fighting Islamic terror by ISIS. And yet in the end, when the Kurdish people kind of like expected to maybe get recognized by countries such as Spain, Ireland, Norway, and Slovenia, all of these Western countries let Kurdistan down. So nobody really cares about Kurdistan. Now, the next conflict that many people oversee is a conflict in the region between India and Pakistan. The region that they're fighting about is called the Kashmir region, and there are some similarities to the Israel-Palestine conflict there, simply because the British also withdrew from India/Pakistan in 1947, I think, and they left behind a mess. And the same thing that happened in the Middle East, they also did there in India and Pakistan, or something comparable at least. And ever since, people there are fighting. So India on the one hand side, Pakistan on the other hand side, and also China has its take on this very bloody conflict that's going on there. Now, also a country that faces many conflicts is China. So in China, we have the Xinjiang region, and many people don't know that a while ago, the region was called East Turkestan. And East Turkestan used to be a republic. And it's the region where the Uyghurs live that many of are incarcerated in China nowadays. But we could also, of course, talk about Tibet, or we could talk about Taiwan. Taiwan, it's a very cosmopolitan state. It's a democratic state. It's a really modern state. Yet no Western country recognizes Taiwan simply because China puts pressure on all countries. As soon as they start to really get in touch with Taiwan officially, China says, we're going to punish you for that. And that is why China dictates how people recognize/do not recognize Taiwan. So a question that arises after looking at all of these conflicts is, why do people focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict so much while they don't really care about all of these other ongoing conflicts? Now, some people say, well, maybe it's the death toll. Maybe the death toll in the Israel-Palestine conflict is very high, and that is why people just feel more emotional about this one. Now, getting the exact numbers is difficult. But once you look at the numbers of Palestinians that died ever since 1948, ever since the establishment of the State of Israel, and also Israelis who died, not counting the deaths of the Arab neighbors who invaded Israel several times and lost the wars, we end up with numbers between maybe 45,000 till 60,000. And of course, that's a lot of dead bodies. That is a lot of horrible atrocities. Yet, if you look into the Kashmir region, you will find out that around about 70,000 people have lost their lives in the Kashmir conflict in a much shorter period of time, starting in the 1980s. Why does nobody focus on the Kashmir region? Why does everybody prefer to look on the Israel-Palestine conflict while not at all caring about the establishment of a Kurdish state, even though the Kurdish people are fighting for their own country for a much longer time than the Palestinian people are. Why does nobody focus on the people of Taiwan who really live a very modern, a democratic life, a free life, and who are being threatened by China over and over again? Why is that? In order to determine whether or not Palestine should be recognized as a state by more Western countries, let's take a look at history first. Of course, one could argue that because Palestine used to be a kingdom back in the days, why should it not be a state nowadays? Well, there's only one problem. There has never been such a thing as a kingdom of Palestine. There has never been a country of Palestine. Neither has there been a state of Palestine. The term Palestine is not even Arabic. It was invented by the Romans, who in 135 after Christ decided to kick out the Jews of their native home country. They kicked the Jews out because the Jews several times tried to stand up to this imperialist Roman power. And after a third try, it was called the Bar Kokhba movement, the Romans decided to kick the Jews out. And in order to really put the Jews down, they decided to name the country after the Jews' biblical enemies, the Philistines. And that is when they started to call the region Syria, Palestina. But not only did they rename the region that inhabited several Jewish kingdoms, but they also took the city that was the most sacred to the Jews, Jerusalem, and they renamed it into Aelia Capitolina. The term Palestine only reappeared after the Ottoman Empire suffered major losses during World War I, and after the British then conquered the land and forced the Ottomans back, they renamed the country Mandatory Palestine. Now, within a short time frame, the country was called Mandatory Palestine, not Palestine. And interestingly, the Arab population, mostly Muslim, they didn't see themselves as Palestinians. They called themselves Arabs, while most people that called themselves Palestinians were the native Jews living in the region. The Arab people started to call themselves Palestinians only in the 1960s. They did so after Arabic neighbors attacked the newly formed state of Israel several times, and each time they started a war, lost the war, and they also lost land. Now, an interesting fact is that the area seen or called as Palestine nowadays, the so-called West Bank and Gaza, they were under Arabic control. From 1948, Israel's War of Independence, till the 1967 war, both of these parts were under Arabic control, not under Israeli control. Within this time, nobody said, why is Egypt occupying Gaza? And why is Jordan occupying the West Bank? Why did nobody say, let's free Palestine from the Egyptians and the Jordanians? Well, nobody could ask for that because the state of Palestine had never existed before. Now, only after these wars that were lost did Yasser Arafat and his people decide to form a people, the Palestinian people, and with them a state. Now, if you don't believe me, then let me challenge you. Who was the Palestinian leader before Yasser Arafat? There was none. Historically speaking, Palestine only started to exist in people's minds in the 1960s. Now, if we seem unable to make a historic argument for the establishment of a state of Palestine, we could also try to make a religious effort. Now, I personally like to read the Quran. I honor the book as one of the 3 holy books of monotheism. But after Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem is seen as the 3rd holiest place in Islam. The only connection with Jerusalem is an assumption. People assume that Muhammad on a winged horse flew into the heavens, And he took off from the spot that actually inhabited 2 Jewish temples before, the Temple Mount. And on the Temple Mount, that inhabited 2 temples historically, many, many hundreds of years before, the Muslims then built the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. If you read the Quran carefully, for example, Surah 5 and 7, you will find out that the land that is now called Israel is promised to the children of the Israelites in the Quran, not only in the Bible. So the holy book of the Muslims promises the land not to the Arabs, but it promises the land to the Jews. This is an interesting fact that doesn't get mentioned very often. Yet it's a game-changing fact when trying to argue religiously. Open the Quran and you will find out that Canaan was given to the Israelites. Now, after finding out that there is neither a historic nor a religious case for the establishment of a state of Palestine, let's take a look at politics. Because of course somebody needs to look after the Palestinian people. They also deserve a safe place to exist. Only in the year of 1988 did Yasser Arafat declare a Palestinian state. That is when he decided that there should be a Palestinian nation. Now, what looked somewhat congruent in 1988 seems much more split nowadays. Again, we have the West Bank being controlled by the Fatah movement, and we have the Gaza Strip being controlled by Hamas. Now, the question is, would it be smart to recognize a Palestinian state ruled by Hamas? Is it smart to recognize a Palestinian state if you say you want to enable the two-state solution, if you want peace to finally move forward, come a little closer? Now, we should take a look at the charter of Hamas. Before the first article, they state, quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. Now, is a state based on a government that promises the obliteration of the Jewish people, and it clearly does so. You can read the full charter yourself. It even wants to wipe out Jews worldwide, not only in the Middle East. Is it smart to legitimize such a movement by now recognizing their own state? Why does a country like Spain recognize a Palestinian state now? Some people are not aware that in Spain, there is also liberation movements. 2 regions for a much longer period of time than the Palestinians are struggling in Spain in order to get their own countries. The Basque region and Catalonia, they both want to get autonomy from the Spanish state. Now, in the Basque region, there used to be a terror organization too. It was called ETA. The terror organization, within all of the years that it was fighting for liberation, killed less than 1,000 people. In one day alone, on the 7th of October 2023, Hamas, together with many Palestinian civilians, killed more than 1,200 Israelis. The massacre they caused, and I saw many recordings. I visited the places right after the attacks happened. The level of violence was so gross, it was so abhorrent, that you would have to create a new language in order to describe how cruel humans can act. Now, after this pogrom that constitutes the greatest killing of Jewish people ever since World War II, ever since the Holocaust, is it the right time to now give the perpetrators the gift of statehood? Or is it the worst possible message one could send? And now this is a message to the Spanish people. What is the message to the ETA terror organization? Should they simply step up again? Should they just massacre more civilians? Maybe they didn't kill enough back then? Should they also rape and cut off women's breasts or put a grenade into a girl's vagina after raping her? What would the Spanish government do then? Would they fight the terrorists, or would they also grant them statehood? What message does the recognition of a Palestinian state after October 7th send? It is the message that if you just cross a line, if you just get so very cruel that a war breaks out, then you get what you wanted. You will be given whatever you want if you just start to really use force as your means of liberation. And now this actually leads me to the main problem, because Hamas doesn't even want statehood. And this is something so important but underreported that it oftentimes leaves me back astonished. Hamas is a radical Islamic terrorist organization, just like Al-Qaeda or Daesh, better known as ISIS. They want a caliphate. They are not even interested in Western statehood. Of course, it's a step on their way. They will definitely say thank you, but then move on forward from that. Hamas wants a caliphate, all the way from Asia to Africa, all the way from Indonesia to Morocco. They want this entire region to become an Islamic caliphate under Sharia rule. Funnily, it again raises a question that has to be put on the table. And once again, it's a question targeting the Spanish government. There is a rule in Islam that every region that once has been conquered by Islam, like the Holy Land, like Israel, it was also conquered back in the days by force, by Arabic forces. But also parts of Spain were conquered by force by Islamic leaders. Now, is Spain willing to also give up on the regions that used to be held by Muslims? Is the Spanish government, after now recognizing statehood to Palestine, also ready to give up a part of its land to some Islamist forces who want to just reestablish their caliphate? Maybe then the Spanish would learn what it means to have an Islamic terror organization sitting in your backyard. A terror organization that instead of building schools, just builds indoctrination propaganda apparatuses. An organization that shoots missiles and that tries to stab you in the back whenever they can, physically speaking. Now, to those arguing that recognizing Palestine as a state right now is a wise step forward in order to get the two-state solution done, again, you'd only have to look into the Hamas charter. Article 11 says, "The Islamic resistance movement believes that the land of Palestine is an Islamic waqf consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day. It or any part of it should not be squandered. It or any part of it should not be given up. Palestine is an Islamic waqf land consecrated for Muslim generations until Judgment Day. This is the law governing the land of Palestine in the Islamic Sharia law, and the same goes for any land the Muslims have conquered by force, because during the times of Islamic conquests, the Muslims consecrated these lands to Muslim generations till the day of judgment." Hamas openly says that they're not looking for building peaceful relations with the state of Israel once Palestine gets declared a state. They do not want to return to any borders, neither 1967 nor anything else but 1948. And again, in 1948, there was no land of Palestine. The only difference was that there wasn't a Jewish state. And this is what is in the interest of Hamas. They're not even hiding it. They want to establish an Islamic caliphate under Sharia law, and they're not interested at all whatsoever in living peacefully with differing neighbors. If you really don't care about Jewish life, if you say, okay, well, then get rid of them whatsoever, I don't give a damn, I want a state of Palestine to get established. What would a state of Palestine under Hamas rule look like? That is the question you should ask. Homosexuals will get thrown off roofs. They will be thrown into the trash. People who oppose the government will get their throats cut. And women. Now, what about women? As so many feminists like to speak up for an organization, a resistance organization that likes to rape women. Now, what does the charter of Hamas say about women? What is the role of the woman in the state of Palestine? Article 17 says, the Muslim woman has a role no less important than that of the Muslim man in the battle of liberation. She is the maker of man. So Hamas uses the same wording that the Nazis used back in the days. The Nazis also said that women's role is to create new fighters. And this is what Hamas openly, publicly states as well. And interestingly, so many feminists just shut their eyes, don't want to hear it, don't want to see it. They take to the streets for an organization that rapes girls, and they take to the streets and declare that putting a grenade into a girl's vagina and exploding it there is some sort of liberation, resistance. Unimaginable to recognize a Palestinian state after October 7th. It is not the world's job to now use symbolic policies in order to gain votes from left-leaning and Islamic voters who inherit the thinking that only Adolf Hitler would have been proud of. You know, I saw Hitler's Mein Kampf. I saw it in stores in the West Bank. You can buy it there. There are stores named after Adolf Hitler. As a person with German descendants, I can only warn you, taking the road that Hamas is taking is a path you don't want to take. It's a dangerous path. It's the path of hate. It's the path of only choosing to see what you want to see. Thank you for listening.
If you enjoyed the podcast, support Tom's independent work now. Your help can come through a one-time donation or a monthly contribution. Your help ensures that more people learn about the topics that matter to you. Click on the link in the description or visit Tom's website for more information. Thank you for listening.